Hey there, everybody. I am joined by Steve and special guest Jim Colson, and we are here to talk about all of the cool stuff with Star Trek CCG. This is a game I've been learning alongside Steve, and we've got the real master here, Jim Colson, who probably has the best Star Trek CCG collection in the galaxy, let's say. And I see he's also wearing a shirt. So, Jim, thanks so much for kind of coming on. We've talked Lord of the Rings, we've talked Star Wars, and we thought we would kind of do the same thing. So Trek was your first game. Can you kind of tell us how you got into it a little bit and, why it holds a special place in your heart?
Well, so it was my first game. I had originally been tried to be introduced to Magic the Gathering in '93, and because I had some not pleasant experiences with Dungeons and Dragons. I played Dungeons and Dragons as a young adult, and then people started accusing everybody that played D&D as being devil worshippers because a couple of crazy people did some crazy things. So everybody was that way. I resisted on Magic the Gathering, even though it was kind of a game that I would have loved to play.
It was designed to be played between D&D games, right? Like that was the original deal,
yep,
right? It's like something to do between
exactly.
games.
And so I just I resisted. And then in '94, sure enough, they came just a year later. They came out with the Star Trek card game, the Next Generation one, and they said they bought me these white borders starter decks, 94 Alpha Premier, and they said, "Hey, here you go. Here's a game like Magic. You love to play it." And I said, "Yeah, now this is something I'll do because." The worst somebody's going to accuse me of being is a Trekkie, and I could live with that. So I picked it up, and then immediately I found out that they got limited edition black borders out there. So on I went to try and I got this obsessive compulsive collecting bug in my genes, and I started trying to hunt down every last black border pack I could find out there, and to this day, I think I probably still got a couple, maybe a full case of black border boosters, and same with starters.
The black border Star Trek Premier is so hard to find. I mean, I got into the game in like '97, and it was like all gone. I've only have a handful of black border Premier cards. It's cool. You got a collection of them.
It's tough, and I was buying booster packs for like $6 a pack, and starter decks for like, I don't know, $20. I think maybe. I can't remember what the starter deck original price was. $10. $9.99. So everything was about double retail when I started buying it. It stayed that pretty flat on that price for a long time, and then recently you could find stuff for less than $5. Well, recently, later on you could find stuff for under $5, but now it's gone back up over quite a bit.
So zooming out a little bit here, Jim. So Star Trek CCG was the longest running Decipher game. It basically ran the entire history of Decipher as a company, at least making card games. Can you kind of walk me through some of those early years? How did you get involved with Decipher, starting to run tournaments, be the volunteer advocate? I think we would love to kind of hear some funny stories and moments from those times. I know it's at this point 25 years ago, 30 years ago, man, time.
Almost, yeah. So Decipher didn't really have good, highly structured, organized play until they got the Star Wars license, right? I think once they got the Star Wars license, they really had some cash flow coming in. And so they really, that's when they got into the organized play and they started with a volunteer squadron and with Star Wars. And then immediately around the same time, it was the Star Trek ambassador program. And I got my original gray back one here. They were so specific that back then they even put your name on it when they sent it out to you.
Yeah.
So it was fully embroidered with your name on it. They moved to a more generic version later on, a little bit different type of material, but you could see that they were not personalized. Nothing to stop you from doing it yourself, but they had a pretty strong. All that program rolled out because Decipher had enough money. So, but to kind of take a step back to the start of it, there really wasn't a ton of organized play. People would kind of get together. Shops would try to host things because they were running Magic tournaments, and they were trying to do the same thing with these other games. So trying to find somebody who's willing to run events was sometimes tough to do. But once Decipher established their organized play, then I started running Star Wars tournaments and Star Trek tournaments in tandem every Saturday. There was one in Huntsville on one Saturday, Alabama, one in Birmingham, Alabama the next Saturday, and then one up in Nashville, Tennessee the following Saturday. And then if there was a special event or a convention or something, usually I was off on a weekend doing that. We had a little bunch of conventions like Mid-South Con and MobiCon down in Mobile, and Deep South Con, and all these little small conventions, Chattacon over in Chattanooga. And so we do a lot of weekends doing stuff like that throughout it evolved, it kind of grew. And we really grew the community significantly through that outreach, that volunteer program Decipher had. It was a pretty brilliant marketing strategy. And, you got all this free labor and all this work for a box of cards, right? So you got a box of cards every release.
I mean, it was also the idea of organized play. Like now it's so, Magic has this the formats, standard, modern, whatever, but I think in 94, 95, it was kind of a novel idea that you'd have a tournament circuit, right? Like it was like this idea that you would have a way for people to get together and play this game, in some sort of organized format. It was sort of like a novel idea. Like now it seems very straightforward, but it's interesting you kind of talking about this. So do you have a kind of a favorite memory from some of the cons? I know you have some cool stuff that you've grabbed, but do you have sort of some favorites?
Yeah, well, so some favorite things, I think were the best time, of course it was, the people that would come to the events were awesome, but going to some of the conventions and hosting stuff, it's, we went to the store that hosted our tournaments actually hosted an event at the Science Center there in Nashville, and the special guest star was Jimmy Doohan. Wow, so we had Scotty there signing autographs. So I got a bunch of cards signed from him. Same thing. They'd have actors come in. So those are some of my favorite memories. Going to, Wizard World in Chicago and San Diego Comic-Con, and meeting some of the real actors and getting their autographs and stuff like that. Mostly all their autographs were on cards. I really didn't care for the big pictures. But Star Trek hosted the 35th anniversary one weekend on Earth here in Huntsville. And so, I mean, all the big names came, all the captains, Shatner, Avery Brooks, Mulgrew, Kate Mulgrew. I mean, they were all here. And so, you could get in line and get autographs and stuff. But the evening, if you got a certain level of pass, you could go out one evening and we had a Space and Rocket Center here, Space and Rocket Center, Star Trek, all together. And
thematic, yeah.
And you got to basically chill with the actors, just, in a very chill environment. And they just were like normal people, good to talk to, great people. And Rene Auberjonois loved the space shot, man. I swear he must have taken it 10 times that night. He loved it.
So I guess kind of moving chronologically here. So Trek was the first big Decipher product, right? And kind of, they had this cash influx with the success of Star Wars. And could you kind of talk about how that community evolved as they kept on adding on more IP? They lost Lord of the Star Wars and added Lord of the Rings, but they're kind of adding some other stuff, whether it's Austin Powers or Dot Hack. How did the community kind of grow and evolve as time moved along?
So, I kind of alluded to some of that, talking about doing tandem tournaments and running around and doing multiple events at conventions. I think you're reaching the same but different people, right? So like me, I'm a big sci-fi buff, so it's not just Star Trek and Star Wars, but it's Babylon 5, it's a lot of the other Stargate, things like that. I still I got huge collections of this too. So the thing is that you kind of reach out to the people that love the sci-fi fiction and stuff like that, and it really kind of brings you together as a community. But the thing about Star Trek is that the tournament scene was never quite as robust as the Star Wars tournament scene. And that was because, not that they had less sales of the product, but because there were more collectors of the product.
Huh, okay.
I mean, this goes back to the Fleer game, right? So we're talking, this kind of bleeds into, what the origins was just next gen. Star Trek, the Decipher only had the next gen license. And so they evolved into once Fleer Skybox product flopped. You got to understand how the licensing thing works, right? When you do licensing, it's not how much you sell, it's how much you make.
Mm-hmm.
They write a contract to make 3 sets or 2 sets or 2 sets with an option third or an option fourth, right? So the way these contracts are structured, it's what you make, not what you sell. So if you make a bunch of product, you send a royalty check off, and then you don't sell it, you're in trouble. And so
right. Jim, question, with the Fleer game, was that Star Trek the original series only?
Strictly, yeah.
Yeah, right. And so was there an overlap between the two? Was this why Decipher couldn't get the original series early on, because the Fleer license was still going?
I'm sorry, what was that?
No, I'm saying, was there overlap between the Fleer card game and the Decipher card game? Was this why Decipher couldn't get the original series license until maybe like 2000 or something?
There was a little bit of overlap. That's why Decipher really, really wanted the first license, right? And so since Fleer's was strictly limited to the original series, right?
Yeah.
It was strictly an original series one. Decipher went for the next gen. And because, when you think about next gen, that also really included Voyager and Deep Space Nine and stuff. So they had a lot of growth potential there, right? By starting with next gen. And so
there's a forgotten
by
CCG,
getting that license and doing well with it, which they did, because they're a game company, they weren't a trading card company. So that was really Fleer's Skybox's downfall, is they figured people just buy it to collect. And people bought enough to collect, but enough not like the gaming community does. And so their game was unimpressive, and it didn't bring the sense of the game of the movies to the player, right? So when you actually play Star Trek, you build your space line out and you do all this, and we're talking first edition right now. You had a sense of going on doing missions. You had a real sense of like an episode. You're creating your own little mini episode, and it had a good feel to it, as far as not knowing what you would encounter, what dilemmas you might run across. So they did a much more better. Well, that's awesome English. They did a much better job of creating the Star Trek environment, that you see and feel in the episodes, than the Fleer game did. And so, especially once they blasted out of the gates with what they did. I mean, they did a limited run, they did an alpha run, they did a beta run. I mean, they made so much product that the checks were rolling into Paramount. Is like, wow. I think Paramount was blown away by the checks that they got from Decipher, the size of the checks they got from Decipher. And so they weren't anything like that from Fleer Skybox. So they when it came time, the negotiation, they said, well, we'd like to expand, what about Deep Space Nine? What about, because effectively those are spin-offs from Next Gen, right? Miles O'Brien's in both series, right? Worf was in both. So when they started talking that, it was like, well, we'll let you have everything, but we got to make sure we close the deal on the original series first. And so, and then when it really took off, once they expanded out to beyond just the Next Gen in that space, then they're able to include the movies and which, when you say movies, you're talking original series, because like the first 7 are all original series, and So anyway, first 5. I can't remember when they kind of merged into next gen, but so yeah, that's how it kind of evolved. Is that I mean, if you were the licensor and one company was sending you teeny tiny checks and the other one was sending you big fat ones, what would you do?
Yeah, it's a pretty easy decision. I'm wondering sort of the tournament scene. I mean, Star Trek feels like a pretty, as you said, you're creating a mission. It's very thematic, but it's even more complex than Star Wars CCG as far as learning the game. And I understand there's some sort of non-interactiveness that was in sort of the early, Trek. Was that something that maybe kind of made like less of a robust tournament scene? You just don't want to play, a 2-hour game, right? It's hard to have a tournament that's 9 hours long and 4 matches, right?
Yeah. So it did struggle a little bit because really there were 2 parts to the game, 2 key main parts, right? So there's the seed phase where you go through and you go and build the space line. So I was playing with a new player one time, and we were sitting, and he's a huge Star Trek fan. He loved the game. He was going to play with his daughters and all sorts of stuff. And so we were playing one time, and so it took us at least 30 minutes to set up the space line and to seed everything, and because it's very strategic. When he put one under, then you put one under. So there's a lot of strategizing. There's another great word that goes along with setting up that space line, right? Well, we spend 30 minutes setting it up, and then we start playing, and bam, this first mission, it's a abort cube. He says, "His crew's dead." He can't do much, and the game's over in 10 minutes and 15 minutes, and it's like all that setup for 10 or 15 minutes of gameplay, and we're done.
Yeah.
It was just kind of
I mean, just personally for me, I have always felt like comparing Star Wars and Star Trek has always been the most fun as a kitchen table game where you're like setting up sort of crazy, goofy scenarios and maybe playing the game over like 2 nights, whatever, but like having a lot of fun with the thematicness of it. Whereas Star Wars, it felt like it's a tuned tournament game. It's about the meta. It's about like figuring out how to counter what deck your opponent's probably going to bring. I mean, they're both fun games for casual and tournament, but I feel like that's kind of a dichotomy for me a little bit.
Yeah, and that's true. But there was a lot of strategy in it, and people really liked that. I mean, that was a great part of the game. That's why, when we moved to 2nd edition, they eliminated the seed phase, right? Effectively. I mean, you kind of still have a seed phase, but it's a microcosm of the original one, right?
It takes like 1 minute, yeah.
When you attempt a planet, that's when you seed it, right? And so, or when you attempt the mission, I'd say that's when you seed it. So it's a little bit more random because you got to draw and hope that you get some good stuff to slow them down. So there's that's kind of less strategic as opposed to the original 1st edition. So those are some stark differences, but it totally eliminates that first 30 minutes of prep work. And I think that streamlining that they did with 2nd edition was just significant. Now they've come out with some stack seed rules that streamlines the seed phase, right? You have 6 missions, you have 6 stacks, right? You just stack, you just seed them it speeds it up a lot. But spending 30 minutes, that was a real negative player experience, and I don't know if that guy.
The current continuing committee tournament format rules, the official tournament format rules, have done a little bit to streamline the seed phase, so certain things happen simultaneously between the players, but it's still longer than most games set up.
Yeah. So, but it was great. I mean, it really brought the flavor of the episodes into the game. So I think that's what people really liked about it quite a bit. So
I'm going to ask a question, then I'll let Steve ask a few of his questions. How did Star Trek kind of rank in Decipher's mind? So, I felt like Star Wars CCG was sort of always like the #1 product they were producing. And then Lord of the Rings kind of supplanted that when the license was lost and there's sort of that swap. It seems like Trek maybe didn't get the love. Maybe I'm wrong here, but did it seem like it wasn't as important of a product or kind of an afterthought almost?
Well, so you got to realize that, Fleer Skybox kind of knew what they were doing, right? They knew that there were a ton of collectors out there, so no matter what they made, they'd have the automatic collectors market. But it really didn't make it as a game. Well, next gen, the Decipher game has this automatically built-in group of buyers that are collecting a game, will never play it. Literally, never play the game. They're just going to buy it because they want the great images, they want the cool cards and stuff like that. They're going to collect it. And so when you pause and think about that, about 80% of Decipher sales were to pure collectors. Now, you're going to have some of that in Star Wars, but not that ratio. And so literally almost no matter what they did with the gameplay, they were still going to sell, 80% of their sales were going to go to collectors. They just wanted to see cool things, great little cool lore quotes, stuff like that. That's what they really wanted to see. And it was to collect the cards and see some cool quotes and had great images, and they could care less about the gameplay. So in a way, it got less attention because the organized play was not as robust as the Star Wars card game. But they don't get me wrong. They still sold plenty of Trek. They sold a lot of Trek. I mean, literally, you think about it: Premiere, Alpha, Beta. I mean, that's a lot of printed product. A lot. And they sold a bunch.
Yeah, thinking back to my old Scry magazine, like top 10 sales of CCGs, I think Star Trek was anywhere between number 3 to like maybe a low of number 7 out of 10, but in the top 10 of all CCGs throughout the 90s.
Yeah, and that's coming from the game stores. That data was collected from the game stores, not the manufacturers. So right. Some of those collectors would go in the game stores and buy, and some of them wouldn't even walk across the front step of the game store. They'd go to Books and Barnes and Nobles or Books A Million or something.
That's right, like Bookstar in California,
Walden Books, and be buying their product off those shelves because they stocked it in those stores.
Right. I forgot that Scry is not tabulating store like sales from Bookstar, maybe even Toys R Us, things like that. Interesting.
Yeah, because those are company secrets, literally how much you sell. I mean, you don't publish that. I mean, initially Decipher published how much they printed, right? That's where we can find that on the first few sets. But then their competitors would come in and say, "Oh, we'll print twice that amount, and so you'll get twice the royalty if we do that." So they shut that down. They stopped publishing how many they printed for every game.
I mean, interesting. I would have guessed the inverse there because I think that when you publish the number, there's 200,000 boxes printed. As a collector, that does something in my brain. It's like there's only 200,000. Like with Magic Alpha Beta, there's only I forget how many million printed, and that's like an immense collectability piece, right? Because you can always come up with new sets, right?
As a collector, it's a critical piece of information to have. I totally agree with you. But as a manufacturer, that's stuff that they learned to hold tight because they were fighting people bidding against them. This is the loss of the Star Wars license. Wizards told them that they were going to produce 10 sets and they were going to produce this amount of every set, which is more than Decipher was making, and et cetera. So they use those numbers against them. Yeah, it's sad. So they stopped publishing them.
Steve, do you want to talk about Decipher kind of fixing the game in 97?
Yeah. So Jim, one thing I've thinking about a lot of Star Trek is that 97 felt like kind of a pivotal year for the game because the Star Trek First Contact film had come out the year before. And I think it was at that moment that Decipher got the license to DS9, Voyager, and I think the TNG films. I'm not sure if they got the TOS license until later, and at that time they also decided to sort of renovate, do like almost like a soft relaunch of the game because in my view, the game from Premiere, Alternate Universe, Q Continuum was a bit slow. It was like play one card, draw one card. But then with First Contact, they added downloads where you can search your deck for cards, free plays, play more cards per turn, totally different battle rules. It seems like they decided at that moment to take the game from being sort of a smaller scale, almost board game experience to being a bigger TCG that's more interactive and more competitive. What was your experience with that? Did you perceive those changes with the First Contact set?
Yeah, so with First Contact, Blaze of Glory got tactics and more, making starship battles more fun rather than just comparison one stat to another stat. To say. Because when you think about Star Trek and some of the cool space battle scenes that they have, and it's just kind of like, that, and again, they were always trying to bring that into the game. Those things where that made it more seem like an episode or a movie or whatever it might be. And so I think that, yeah, I agree that by adding that in, so you have to be careful about power creep, right? So we saw some games like Pokemon or Dragon Ball Z or something like that really, every release that came out, all the power, all the characters were double.
Yeah.
And so you had to have the new set to be competitive, because now your power wouldn't work.
Yeah.
So Decipher, one of the things they did do is they by adding additional mechanics and side decks, things like Q10, things like that, as those doorways, as they started to expand those mechanics, that allowed them to bring in new cool mechanics that allowed the players to have a much more customized experience in their deck building and in their gameplay. So they had to be prepared for starship battles.
So I just have a thought here. I mean, it seems like Decipher in all their games favored adding complexity over adding power creep. I mean, I think this happened with Star Wars CCG as well. You start adding defensive shields, and all of a sudden you have like a 60 card deck, then you have a 15 card deck. So instead of banning cards or trying to address power creep, they just made things more complex, right? It sounds like that happened with Trek as well.
So so that kind of goes to second edition, right? So we were starting to grow things, and they banned raise the stakes. They banned, that was the only card they ever banned, I think.
A gambling card for that had
the gambling card. And there's a few things that because that was a totally negative player experience, and parents don't like kids losing cards to some adult, right? And so it was a super I don't even know how it got past production, one of those
Can
things.
you just remind folks, like, what does that card do exactly, just in like 10 seconds? What is it, the card?
So you randomly bet a card at the start of the game, and whoever loses wins the card. So you shuffle your deck, and the player reaches in and pulls out a card, and if you lose the game, he wins that card.
Yeah, I could see
how that make the game illegal in some state jurisdictions, I think. Yeah.
There was this pretty negative player experience aspect to that. Yeah. So they got banned.
Jim, question for you. So I feel like there's a golden age of Star Trek sets, First Contact, DS9, Dominion, Blaze of Glory, and so forth. But then towards the end, something sort of happened, and Voyager, the Borg, Holodeck Adventures, and then motion pictures, the power level just went through the roof, and I feel like there was a drop off in interest towards the end. What exactly happened to first edition at the end of its run?
So some of that is, they tried to bring additional, not use the Lord of the Rings term, cultures. They tried to bring additional affiliations into the game, right? So you got the Erogen, you got all the new affiliations that were in Voyager that were brought into the game, and so when you strayed from the core stuff that you found really in Next Gen and Deep Space Nine, Voyager didn't have as big a following, and so as they were doing the Voyager sets, which include Borg and things like that, the Borg is great because it's a core theme with Next Gen, but and Borg got quite an amount of play in tournament, but I don't remember seeing anybody playing the Vidian deck. I do remember a few people playing Vidians, but they were never successful. So they were young young affiliations compared to mature ones, right? And so the mature ones are going to win out because they got a lot more resources and capabilities and people and skills and stuff. So I think that some of the things that they did by introducing additional affiliations, while it was cool and gave people a chance to play things they never would, you always ended up with the guys that only ever played Federation decks, or only ever played Romulan decks, or only ever played Klingon decks. I mean, literally, you had those mainstays of people that's all they wanted to play was Fed deck or whatever, and or a Romulan deck or something. And so all those other affiliations, I don't care about that stuff. So So yeah, there was it was a great conceptual idea, but in the end, when those later sets came out with all these different affiliations, it was it's, yeah, you can see interest waned a little bit because
Right,
I don't
right.
care about Herogen or even
Yeah, I remember as a friend who's a big
Renee or
Romulan player, and he would check in and he'd be like, "Oh, Voyager set's out. There's one card for me in this set." Okay, or the
yeah,
Borg set, there's like
exactly.
three maybe. Yeah, so he would buy very very little of the set.
I mean, Tribbles was popular because it had original series stuff in it, right? So everybody wanted to get Kirk and the Spock and Al McCoy and all those guys. They wanted all that stuff. So Tribbles was a great set for them. Plus, they introduced that little side game that is really underappreciated. And I watch them people play that game endlessly at conventions. It's a pretty fun game. The Tribbles side game is, but I wouldn't play it as part of the game itself. I always played it the 2-player or the multiplayer box set.
Yeah.
So kind of moving on chronologically here, I think we're approaching the second edition period. I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts on second edition? This relaunch of the game. It's something that I think they would have done with Star Wars CCG if they would have kept the license. It's something arguably I think they should have done with Lord of the Rings instead of Shadows. So what are your thoughts on second edition?
So second edition was a huge risk for Decipher, right? So I'm a TOS guy, right? I grew up coming home from school as a kid, turned on TV and watching James T. Kirk go save the universe, right? So I'm an original series guy, but I love Next Gen too. And Deep Space Nine, I think of all the series, is my wife and I's favorite series to rewatch. And so so when we're thinking about all that, and so by moving to second edition, they fixed some of the structural issues that first edition had, right? And it really made the game a more of a streamlined game. But there was a little bit pullback on the Star Trek experience, the episodic experience, in order to achieve that. And so it's one of those things that first edition guys will say, "Oh no, it's the only real good Trek game is first edition," right? But if you're a gamer and you like games and you like Star Trek, second edition was a really nice experience to play. I mean, it was a lot more of a game friendly playing experience, and we enjoy playing lots of second edition as well. So I think that when you mentioned Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, that they were at the point, especially you had the first edition icon, first episode 1 icon on the last 3 sets, Coruscant, Tatooine, and Theed Palace. They were moving to thematic or a second edition move to say, okay, now we're going to have episode 1 tournaments only. They were all ready to move to that type of thematic move.
All pod racing all the time. It's only pod racing.
Yeah. So it's so when you think about it, there was a huge pushback on moving to second edition because collectors are saying, well, if I can't play with the card, I don't care. Well, most of the collectors didn't say that. It was the players, and so we had a big drop off in organized play because the players didn't want to learn a new game. And there were some new mechanics, but it was still Star Trek.
I mean, for me, I think it was also a little bit of an expense issue too, because I was like in high school and second edition came out. I was like, oh, I'm gonna buy a whole new game. I've got this game, and I'll just stick with first edition. Send my allowance money on finishing that game up.
Yeah, so. But still, look at Magic. They blow away entire sets and say, nope, no longer tournament legal. Sorry, you can't use them on a regular basis. So,
but the mechanics remain the same, right? They haven't added a new color, right? It's the core mechanics are there. I mean, mana has been broken for 20 years, right? They refuse to add in like a designated lands deck, right? Which would be a fix, right? Like every turn you get a land, there's like, no. You can actually lose a game if you just have a bad draw. They added a mulligan rule, they changed the mulligan rule, but fundamentally it's still the same game, right?
So, yeah, I played a few games where mana screw was
it's real, right? You could just have a bad draw and you're like, I'm going to lose this match, right? And so Any kind of other questions from you, Steve? I think we want to close
No, I
the
think that
show with,
covers it. Yeah.
some show and tell. I think Jim's got some really cool stuff in his collection. We thought it'd be fun to do a little bit of a show and tell, some of the cool stuff that he's collected. Also, just want to draw attention to the AT-AT hanging from the fan up there. That's a big fan of that.
Yeah, so that's a popcorn bucket, by the way. It's a Disney popcorn bucket.
Really, I thought it was a Lego. I thought it was the Lego one, and I was like, I'd be nervous because
that would be really gutsy to hang a Lego AT-AT from a ceiling fan.
It's a popcorn bucket. It's a Disney popcorn bucket.
Wow.
Huh. Okay.
So some of the stuff I grabbed, and this will be kind of quick, but I participated in a lot of these regional and national events. Like Decipher asked me to come help judge the Worlds, and so I got lucky and went there. And so in my binders, I have really cool things. Like I have these autographed DeCarans, one's to my wife and one's to me.
Oh, that's very sweet.
So try to get that so there's no glare on it. And so I got a couple autographs to Karen. I got one that's not got an autograph on as well too. Here's another fun one that's autographed.
Yeah, that Patrick Stewart autograph on Lucutus.
Yeah, that's pretty really nice cool. on the oversized stuff. And of course, a bunch of this stuff, the color foil and the non-foil ones, the blanks, white cards, all sorts of stuff. The non-printed Geordie, and then just tons of cast member autographs. So these are just some you see. There's a couple Jimmy Doings here. There you go. You can see it there without the glare. And I got Leonard Nimoy and a few others. A bunch of I got like one. There's Beth Crusher. Bunch. I don't know, 20 pages. 20 pages of autographs. All across all the series. There's some with Renee. He's passed.
Oh man, yeah, that's really cool to have those.
But it's lots of fun. One of my fun memories of autographs and doing stuff is we were in Nashville, Tennessee, and store owner who was hosting a big event invited Lita Chase Masterson to come down, and so she was a guest star at this event. And of course, she brought her boyfriend with her. You know who her boyfriend was, right?
We learned about this recently. Yeah, Warren Holland.
So Warren Holland was hanging out, and the winner of the tournament got to have dinner with her, and so I think it was West Victory who won the event. I can't remember for sure who it was, but maybe the runner-up to Scott Category 1 game Scott Church. He was at that event, and I think he passed on the dinner, and so they found out where it was at. Some of the players did, and so we got invited as the tournament officials, right? And so we were sitting there, the store owner, Warren, Chase Masterson, a couple other volunteers, myself, my wife, and a few other people, and we were sitting there eating dinner, and this big group of people come in and sit in the corner, a bunch of players, the Lacey's. And a few of the other big players, and they Steve. Anyway, so we were all sitting in a corner, goofing up, drinking. And as she excused herself, her and Warren were walking out the door. One of them yelled, "Gosh, what did they yell? Something like storm the battalion, storm the walls," or something like that. It's so embarrassing. She just.
I mean, it's so like Star Trek is interesting because I think like the Star Wars just never had that sort of cachet. I mean, even now, it's like the actors in Star Wars, like Harrison Ford doesn't sign stuff because he think it's like pesky, right? It's like annoying, right? Like or it's getting these big name signatures like Natalie Portman's signatures like $600 to sign in. There's not as much that fan interaction, that sort of organic environment. I think a little bit. Right. Okay, what do you got next? I see a big role here.
Yeah, so another thing is that we used to do lots of conventions, and sometimes Decipher would send support, and sometimes we were big at different conventions. So on the major conventions, they had these big carpet walls, and on the carpet walls they'd hang up big sticker oversized cards. I mean, really oversized cards. For example, this is Star Wars one. I got a bunch of these Star Trek ones, but I didn't get them pulled out in time. So this is like an oversized card from Star Wars, right? And so I got I got some Star Trek ones, but they had some prototype ones that they made that I never saw these at the event, but ended up getting a hold of them. You probably, if I would give you a couple of guesses, you'd probably know who it was. But I made a major trade with a Star Wars collector. He got his hands on these, and you can see the size of this thing. This is,
Wow.
this has got to be at least 30 inches. It's got to be, it's probably got to be about 30 inches tall. And
In
there's
white
two
border,
here.
which is not they never made those
Why they
in white
picked
border.
7 to see, I have no idea. But
It's a random one, yeah.
But these are a couple artifacts I got, from that era. And like I said, I ran out of time. I couldn't pull out the oversized, the ones that were on the wall, but I got some pretty cool ones. They're Picard and a few others that are really pretty sweet. So.
Well, Jim, we really appreciate your time, and we might do a follow-up, and maybe we can do a bigger show and tell. Folks, if you have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. We'll try to get those answered. I think this is a really fun conversation. You're one of my favorite folks to have on here, Jim, and just sort of talk about this stuff and hear the stories and little histories. Steve, final thoughts or last questions?
No, nothing more for me. That was really interesting, Jim. Really appreciate it. Sharing all your thoughts and memories.
All right. Well, no problem. Just let me know, and I'll see if I can carve out some more time if you want to do something a little bit more specialized or something, maybe
Sure.
a little shorter. I don't know.
If
This
folks
is much
wanna get
better than the Star Wars one.
let us know.
What, an hour 20 or something?
Yeah, the Star Wars one was like an hour 20. I was like, all right, this is basically the same as watching a movie, which I think it's the same quality, right? The video quality might not be the same, but entertainment value. So I really appreciate it. And folks, like I said, if you want to hear something or see future content, let us know, right? We're very open to new videos. This is a small operation over here, so very, very available. So thanks again, Jim, and we'll see everybody next time.
All right. Bye.